They called him Mr. Leonard at the VA sometimes, but more often, just the old guy with the cane who talks to flags, muttered behind gloved hands in the halls. A few even rolled their eyes when he saluted the empty wall outside the pharmacy line, not knowing it used to hold a memorial plaque. He never corrected them. He just sat on that bench under the broken clock, coat zipped high even when it was warm, fingers curled tight around a folded letter he hadn't opened in 20 years. The letter from command. The one they gave him before they told him his team was never coming home. He kept it sealed all this time, until the morning he didn't show up for his regular check-in. They found him still dressed, slumped in the chair, boots laced, that same letter tucked into his chest pocket. And when they went to clean out his apartment, an efficiency stacked with worn boots, ration tins, and a jar full of quarters, they opened a shadow box under his bed. Inside were 3 medals that nobody recognized, 1 dog tag scorched at the edge, and a photo faded near to dust. Him, standing straight-backed in the jungle, arm around a younger soldier with a grin too wide for the war they were in. Beneath it, a hand-signed note from a 4-star general, inked in a time before email. That's when they started asking questions. But Leonard Briggs never needed anyone to remember him after the fact. He wanted people to look up while he was still walking among them, even if that walk had turned into a shuffle. If you believe no veteran should be forgotten, especially not while they're still breathing, make sure to like and subscribe. Because what happens next? You won't believe who else remembers Leonard Briggs. And so when the rain started coming down on Charleston that day, and he stepped out of the VA building into a blur of traffic and horns, it didn't surprise him that no one stopped. He tapped his cane twice on the pavement, checked the address the nurse had printed for him, Charleston Veterans Legal Aid, 18 blocks west, and then, reluctantly, opened the Uber app he hated using. The driver pulled up fast, glossy black SUV, hip-hop thumping through the windows. The guy barely looked at him, just popped the trunk from inside and kept talking on his Bluetooth. Leonard struggled to lift his bag. He never liked asking for help, but the cane slipped and the bag hit the curb, and the driver groaned like someone had ruined his whole afternoon. "You got it? Or what, man?" Leonard didn't answer, just nodded faintly and climbed in, 1 stiff leg at a time. The driver sighed. Should have taken a cab. The ride was silent except for the tap-tap of the driver's fingers on his phone every time they hit a red light. Leonard stared out the window, raindrops running down the glass like slow bullets, hands folded tight on his lap. The driver kept glancing in the mirror like he was trying to make sure Leonard didn't have a heart attack and ruin his interior. A few blocks from the address, Leonard asked, quietly, politely, if the driver could drop him closer to the covered curb. "I can't do the steps in this rain." The guy scoffed, "You and everybody else." Then came the moment. The one he'd remember forever. They stopped near the crosswalk. Leonard opened the door and began to get out slowly, carefully. His cane struck the sidewalk and slipped slightly. That's when the driver said, loud and annoyed, "You're blocking traffic, dude," and leaned over. The door, still halfway open, slammed into Leonard's side with a shove that sent him spinning. His cane flew, his knee buckled, and he staggered into the road, right into the middle of a live intersection. Horns blared. Someone yelled. Tires screeched. And a black vehicle skidded to a halt inches from Leonard's body, his hands trembling in the air like he was trying to signal to ghosts. The back door of that car opened. A security agent jumped out. And then came her. Governor Elise Monroe, press suit dark with rain, heel sharp against the concrete. She didn't hesitate. She rushed to Leonard and knelt down in the middle of the street, coat soaking in the puddle. "Leonard Briggs," she said like a whisper, eyes searching his face. "Is that you?" He blinked. He remembered that voice, decades younger, from a ROTC summit in Georgia. He had once given a talk to cadets about field leadership. One of them had been Elise Monroe. "Ma'am," he said, voice thin. "I didn't know you were still in public service." She smiled like she might cry. "Because of you." And then she stood, slowly, deliberately, turned to the Uber driver, and said the words that would ignite every screen in America. "You just shoved a Bronze Star veteran into oncoming traffic. I'm the governor of this state. And I saw everything." The driver opened his mouth, but no sound came. Phones were out. People were filming. But Leonard didn't move. He just stayed on his knees, the rain soaking through his sleeves, eyes closed for a beat too long. Because in that moment, for the first time in years, someone had called him by name. Not old man. Not sir. His name. And he had almost died before anyone said it. The silence hit like a wave, not the kind that calms, but the kind that holds the air hostage. I stood in the street soaked to the bone, the water pooling in the cuff of my pants, and for once, no one rushed me. They were all frozen, their phones raised, their judgment coiling like smoke. Governor Monroe didn't blink. She reached down, took my arm, and helped me to my feet like I was made of glass and memory. Her security team formed a half circle around us, one of them barking into a radio, "Alpha 1 has a live incident. Civilian injured. Eyes on." But Elise didn't care about protocols. She looked me over like she'd known me all her life. "We're taking him to the Capitol," she said, and just like that, I was being helped into the back of the governor's car, the seat warmer already on, the leather slick from my coat. The Uber driver? He stayed frozen at the curb, mouth working like he might say something clever, but no words came. Traffic was a cathedral of quiet, and in that pause, something changed. Not just the people watching, not just the news that would spread in minutes, but something in the city itself. By the time we reached the Capitol complex, a crowd had already begun to form. Not because I was famous. I wasn't. But because someone in power had treated an old, soaked stranger like he mattered. That sort of thing didn't go unnoticed anymore. Inside the Grand Rotunda, the marble gleamed and echoed beneath our feet. I hadn't walked these halls since 1986 when I was brought in for a logistics brief, and nobody had asked for my name then. This time, I was met with silence, then footsteps, then cell phones lowered as people stared, not at the governor, but at me. Governor Monroe stood beside me and said to the press without a podium or a microphone, "This man was pushed into a live intersection because someone saw age, not honor. But I saw Leonard Briggs, a leader, a soldier, a man who changed the way I lead." The words hit harder than anything the rain had thrown at me. I didn't know what to say. I never liked speeches. I'd always told the young ones, make your decisions on the ground, not at a podium. But now I stood on polished tile under a brass dome while microphones leaned like flowers toward me. I didn't speak. I just opened the inside pocket of my coat and pulled out the folded letter I'd carried since '72, the one they'd found clutched to my chest the day I missed my check-in, and handed it to the governor. She read it aloud, a commendation for field leadership, dated 3 weeks before my unit was ambushed in Kisan. Signed by Major General Whitmore, long since buried, but his ink still legible. As her voice cracked at the last sentence, whose action saved 17 lives at risk to his own, the rotunda went silent again. Not for applause. Not for spectacle. But for grief. The kind that sits in your chest for decades. Elise folded the letter carefully, hands shaking just a little, and tucked it into her own jacket. "This stays with me now," she said. "You've carried it long enough." By the time she'd finished speaking, the Uber driver's name had already hit the feeds. Videos were up. Screenshotted moments of him glaring, arms crossed, as I hit the pavement. A woman on Twitter posted, "My father served with Leonard Briggs. You just messed with the wrong warhorse." And they were right. Not because I was looking for revenge. I wasn't. But because when you carry something quiet long enough, the moment it speaks, the world listens. By late afternoon, a dozen veterans stood outside the Capitol, flags in hand, some in wheelchairs, some leaning on walkers, one holding a cardboard sign that said simply, "He deserved better." Elise came outside herself and handed out umbrellas. I stood with them, coats still wet, cane planted like a post in the brickwork, and watched as the city shifted in real time. Uber issued a statement. "We do not tolerate discrimination or abuse of riders." But it was too late. The driver had already been removed from the platform, banned across state lines, and now faced a civil inquiry. But that wasn't the win. That wasn't what mattered. What mattered came quietly, just after sunset, when I was alone in the guest room of the governor's residence, still too stunned to sleep, and the door creaked open. Elise stepped inside with a manila envelope in one hand and an old ROTC yearbook in the other. She sat beside me like no time had passed since Georgia. "You told me once," she said, flipping to a bookmarked page, "that real leaders remember the names of the ones who watched the doors." She tapped the photo. "You remembered mine. Today, I remembered yours." And she handed me a fresh envelope, sealed, stamped, dated today, a personal note of recognition signed by the president himself. "You're not invisible anymore, Sergeant Briggs," she said. "You never were. We were just too busy looking past you." And I couldn't hold it in. Not the tears, not the weight. Not the fact that I had waited a lifetime just to be seen again, not as a burden, but as a man who once held a line no one else would. I never needed applause. I never asked for flags or marches. But in that room, with the governor who once sat in my briefing and the letter I'd never expected to receive, I felt something return. Something I thought I'd left in the jungle. I was still standing. And now? They were standing with me. It didn't take long for the headlines to spin. Elderly vet assaulted in broad daylight. Governor steps enduring Uber scandal. Bronze Star recipient identified after viral video. But by the time the news anchors were debating my name, the storm had already passed through me. I wasn't watching TV. I was sitting on the Capitol steps at dawn. Same clothes, same cane, same silence, watching the flag rise in that slow, sacred way you only understand if you've ever had to fold one over a friend. I didn't want press interviews. I didn't want pity. I wanted what every soldier wants after the war ends, to be still, to be useful, to be remembered for the right reasons. So when the governor asked if I'd speak at the legislative address that Friday, I almost said no. But then I saw the list of attendees, not just the officials or the donors or the dignitaries, but the public schools. Rows of kids, dozens of them, ages 10 to 18, none of whom had seen anything I'd seen, but all of whom were about to decide what kind of adults they'd become. That's who I spoke to. Not the Senate. Not the cameras. The kids. I told them a story, not about war, not about medals. About a door. How I was once shoved through one, into mud and fire, and how I learned the only way to survive was to hold the next door open for someone else. I told them about watching men die with their eyes still open, and how the hardest part of coming home wasn't the scars, it was being treated like a burden when all you ever wanted was to serve again. And I ended with something no one expected. I pulled out the cane, that old aluminum one with duct tape on the handle, and I held it up. This is the only thing that stopped me from falling all the way that day. Not just to the ground, but into nothing. I paused, made sure they were listening. But what really caught me was someone who remembered my name. After the speech, something strange happened. The governor's office was overwhelmed, not by press, but by letters from students. Kids asking about medals. Kids saying they told their grandparents they were proud of them. One boy wrote, "I held my granddad's hand tighter today. He always walked slow. I didn't know why until I heard about you." That's when I realized something. This wasn't about me. It never was. It was about a whole generation of men and women who walked like ghosts through their final decades, never once hearing their stories repeated. So we started something. Not a foundation. Not a museum. Something simpler. A bench. Just one. Placed at the very intersection where I was shoved into the road. Made of black iron and cedar, with a plaque that reads, "For the ones still walking. We see you." No fanfare. No ribbon cutting. Just a place to sit. And every now and then, when I go there with a thermos in my coat and the city swarming around me like always, someone stops. A teen with a skateboard. A woman with a stroller. A city worker on break. Sometimes they sit. Sometimes they ask questions. Sometimes they just nod. But the bench is never empty. A month after the incident, Uber's CEO reached out. He wanted to apologize personally. I told him the apology should come in the form of training, not a photo op. And I asked for something else. Every new driver in the state had to sit through a 3-minute video on respecting those who served. And guess whose voice narrates it? Not mine, the governor's. "You never know who you're driving," she says in that calm, sure voice. "But you always know what dignity looks like." The driver who shoved me? His name never trended. No mugshot, no courtroom drama. Just a letter, one page, hand-delivered to me in a plain envelope. No excuses, no blame. Just one line. "I saw you after the rain. I've been trying to see everyone better since." That was enough. Because I wasn't interested in crushing anyone. I just didn't want the next Leonard Briggs to be invisible. I didn't want the next soldier-turned-stranger to be shoved into silence. So now I walk slower, not because of the cane, but because I know people are watching. And I make sure they see me. I wear the faded cap, the weatherproof coat with the pins still clipped to the breast. I tip it to the bus drivers, the kids outside the schools, the barista who never calls me sir, but always remembers my name. And on Veterans Day, I don't stand at the memorial. I sit at that bench. The one near the crosswalk. I pour black coffee into a tin cup. And when someone asks if the plaque's about me, I always smile the same way. It's about all of us. The war ended a long time ago. But respect is still on patrol. And if you're listening to this, if you saw the video, or read the story, or heard your grandfather get quiet in the middle of a sentence, you're part of the mission now. The world won't remember Leonard Briggs because he fell. They'll remember him because he stood.